Sammen med en gruppe australske lærere har Dr. David Rose udviklet metoden Reading to Learn. I Læsemagasinet i dag viser vi et oplæg af Dr. David Rose, hvor han præsenterer metoden og viser, hvordan man kan bruge den i sin undervisning. Værsgo at se med.
Okay. Thanks so much, Clara. Look, it's just wonderful to come all this way and to meet you all here. We've been working with the Danish team and the other European partners on the Tell for Ill project for the last year, and I'm really optimistic about what's going to happen. We have tremendous organisation from people like Clara and Ruth Malvad here in Denmark, and our other leaders. They asked me to present for the Danish team the talk that I gave in Stockholm earlier on, but what I'm going to start with is a more general introduction to Reading to Learn, so just to put it in a bit of context for us. And I have to say that Tell for Ill is a kind of extension of the work that we've been doing in Australia over the last 30 years really, but particularly the last 10 years, and the person who really got this off the ground, Claire Acevedo, was really seminal in getting this happening in Australia through her work as a coordinator of teacher professional learning for the Catholic Education Office in Melbourne, which was a major proving ground for our professional learning program. But we started out, the program actually started out from a basis with the genre pedagogy that's been developing in Australia since the early 80s, which was initially focused on writing. At the time, you may be aware that Australia had taken on board the process writing fashion in a big way, and it was having disastrous effects particularly for children from less advantaged backgrounds. We have a very large proportion of non-English speaking people in Australia. We also have Indigenous students who were not succeeding with methodology. So the genre writing pedagogy really took off as a way for teachers to explicitly teach those students how to write successfully for school. And it took off from Joan Rothery, as a teacher educator, worked with Jim Martin, who's a text linguist. They collected a very large sample of the kinds of writing that children are doing in school, the kinds of writing that's valued by teachers in the primary school, and developed a pedagogy for enabling teachers to teach this kind of writing explicitly at a time when the fashion was to say that children learn from within and we shouldn't impose any kind of learning on them in the process writing methodology. Now, this has developed over the last 30 years. So the second stage of the genre pedagogy was to go into the high school and look at the kind of reading and writing that's expected of students across the curriculum in the high school. That was a major research project in the 90s. And then the third phase of genre pedagogy is focusing on reading as a starting point for learning literacy, with writing as the outcome, and embedding both reading and writing in teaching the curriculum at all year levels across the curriculum, in school and beyond. So our starting point is with the problem. The problem is inequality in participation and outcomes in schools, and these are two little examples that illustrate this kind of problem. In the upper primary school on the left-hand side, we have a student who can write a successful explanation. I'll just read you the first paragraph to give you an idea of what that student's capable of. It's titled, "How do we breathe?" The respiratory system is made up of three important organs that are the nose, trachea and lungs. The exchange of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, are necessary for us to survive and are enabled by this system. So that's the kind of level of technical language that this student at the age of 10 or 11 is able to command. This student is thoroughly prepared for the demands of the secondary school. They'll be prepared to learn independently from reading the text across the curriculum. They'll be able to demonstrate successfully what they've learnt from reading and they have a bright future. On the other hand, we have a failing student in upper primary, a student of the same age, that's writing a text like this. A frog is a member of the toad family, and it is an amazing creature and croaks and jumps and climbs up wall. First the frog lays sticky eggs in water so they can stick to reeds. The little tadpole is a tiny speck, and it eats and grows bigger and bigger and so forth. So this is a student who is clearly ill-prepared for the demands of the secondary school, and the chances are that student will not succeed and have far less opportunities in life than the student on the left. So this is the problem that we are faced with, that we had to deal with. Now, the combination of the reading strategies that we've been developing over the last 10 years in Reading to Learn, and the writing strategies that were developed earlier, and the knowledge about language across the curriculum has given teachers tools to produce these kinds of results. So here's an example of a student in junior secondary who's writing like this. And this is not uncommon. On the left-hand side, D, the best, making people laugh. Very cheeky, if want to. Can get loud and quiet. I am short-tempered. So this is, and of course it's almost illegible. So this is a child who's made it all the way through primary school, is in junior secondary school, and clearly has very limited chances with further education. Now, after 2 months of the strategies that we've been developing, this is what this student is able to do independently. Mum Shirl, Shirl Smith. Shirl Smith was also known as Mum Shirl. Mum Shirl was famous for helping people who were needy and prisoners. Her education was difficult because of her illness, epilepsy. Her schooling failed because she couldn't go to school. Back then, times were difficult for Aboriginal people. They took away your children, and so forth. So this student is able to independently read factual texts, to be able to identify information, and to use that information to write new texts themselves. So that's the kind of improvement we can see happening in just 2 months of school using these techniques. Within a year or so, this student will be up to the level that they need to succeed in the secondary school. If they didn't have that kind of intervention, this is the kind of results that we would see. So part of what we do is getting teachers to continually assess their students' growth as they're going through the school year, and we ask them to assess students in the bottom, middle and top range in their classes. And this shows the kinds of results that they get before they start using Reading to Learn. Here's the beginning of school. We can see there's all the children are near the bottom because they've only just starting school. Some are much lower than others. By the beginning of year, after a year or two of school, these top children have shot up into the top range for their years, but the children who are in the bottom range are still failing. Here we are after another year or two of school. Again, the top children are still up in the top range, and the bottom children have improved slightly, but they're still in a failing range. And that continues year after year through the primary school until we get to secondary school and we find exactly the same gap. So to us, the problem with literacy, with education outcomes, lies not with the children, it lies with a fundamental feature of our education systems all over the world. It's not just Australia, it's not just Denmark, it's all over the world. There's a huge gap in so-called ability differences within schools, within classes, within regions, within nations. And we have to focus on closing that gap. So after a year of teachers being trained in these strategies, they test their students again. We find that the students at the beginning of school are now all up into the top range for their year level. These students here, the same students, same teachers, we have the students who started at a failing level are now up to the average standard for their years on average. The top students have accelerated as well. We see this, and the same pattern all the way through The first 2 years of school, middle primary, upper primary and into secondary. On average, all of these children who normally fail year after year in school are now up to an acceptable standard for their age. They've accelerated an average of 4 times standard growth rates, and the students at the top have accelerated at an average 1.5 times standard growth rates. So the kind of strategies that we've been designing and working with teachers for over the last 30 years are clearly successful. So how do we achieve it? Well, there's 3 components to this. One has to do with understanding learning. Another, understanding language. And the third one is being able to design pedagogy. So teachers, to achieve these kinds of results, need to have independent, confident control over those 3 dimensions of knowledge. So to start off with the understanding of learning, we have a very straightforward model of learning. Essentially at the centre of it is that learning happens through doing. Learning happens through tasks, and if we look at any learning theory or any learning situation, we find that we all basically work with the same assumption. In order for learning to happen, the learner has to do the task. You can't do the task for them, they have to be able to do it themselves. And that's central to any kind of learning situation, any kind of learning theory, whether or not this is made conscious. Now, in order to do a task successfully that you've never done before, requires some kind of preparation from somebody who knows how to do the task. This is obvious in manual occupations, in domestic situations, where an expert teacher, parent, master shows the learner how to do the task, and then the learner then practices the task with the master's guidance. It's less obvious in an educational situation. So if we're learning from reading a textbook, for example, where does the guidance come from learning the textbook? Well, the answer is that it happens cumulatively over a long period of time for those who do it successfully. Now, for the learning to happen, the task has to be done successfully. If we fail at a learning task, it constrains the capacity for learning. And that's particularly the case for students who are constantly failing at learning tasks. The more you fail, the more it constrains your capacity for learning. So our focus is on enabling every learner, every student in a class to be able to do each task successfully, because successful completion of a learning task opens up the capacity for taking another step in learning, whether that's the next step in a sequence of activities or it's a higher level of understanding. And we call this elaborating. So basically the model is a cycle. As you can see, we call it the scaffolding learning cycle. It involves 3 basic steps. Prepare the learner to do the task successfully. The learner does the task successfully, and that forms a basis on which we can raise the level of understanding with elaboration. We can take that a step further and look at it as a sequence. So that gives us what Jerome Bruner called a spiral learning curriculum. At each step in the spiral involves a task, and the task becomes steadily more complex. Each step, the learner is being prepared for the task, it's being elaborated, forms a platform for the next task, and so forth. So that's a very straightforward model in which we can start designing learning activities which are going to enable every student to succeed with reading and writing. Next step, we need to understand the nature of the task. In order to be able to prepare a learner to do a task successfully, you need to understand the nature of the task. Now that's very straightforward if it's a manual task like making a chair or tying your shoelaces or cooking a dish for dinner. It's a lot more complicated when it comes to language, because language is the most complex phenomenon we know of. So teachers need to develop a clear and applicable, practical understanding of the learning tasks that they can translate into lessons. So we start with the basic principle that all children come to school knowing language is made of words, oral words. When they learn to read and write, they also realise it's made of sentences. So that gives us another level. And as teachers, we know that language is made of texts. So here we have 3 levels to language: the text, the sentence, and the word. Texts don't float around independently. They exist in contexts. The context includes the subject matter, what it is we're talking about, the relations between speakers and readers and writers. So this is the essential model of language we're working with as text in context, with 3 levels to language. And Michael Halliday, in his systemic functional theory of language, has formalised this as the model we work with. But we're not going to go there yet. We're going to just complexify the language task a little, because we know that a text is not made of just strings of sentences. It's composed of phases of meaning which we express as paragraphs in writing. Likewise, a sentence is not just a string of words. It's composed of groups of words that express chunks of meaning. So in the sentence, a frog was swimming in a pond after a rainstorm, we could ask how many word groups there are there. You thinking about it? So who's it about? Could you answer me? A frog, thank you. And what was he doing? Swimming. He was swimming. Where was he swimming? In a pond. And when was he swimming in a pond? After a rainstorm. So there are 4 groups of words. No punctuation, but every 5-year-old knows that that sentence is made of those 4 chunks of meaning. Who it's about, what he was doing, where and when. Similarly, a word is not just a string of letters, although very weak readers think it might be. It's made up of chunks of letter patterns. And the foundation of the spelling system in alphabetic systems is the syllable. And a syllable consists of 2 pieces of letter patterns. So what we have here are patterns of patterns of patterns of patterns of patterns, immensely complex. And we've only just scratched the surface here. Patterns at the level of the text, at the level of the sentence, at the level of the word. And when we read, write, speak and listen, we don't process each of those patterns one by one. We process the whole lot simultaneously and automatically. An immensely complex task. If you're struggling at any one of those levels, at the level of decoding letters, you won't have enough cognitive space to handle the level of meaning. If you're struggling at the level of meaning, you won't have enough cognitive space to process the decoding. Right? So this is a fundamental understanding we need to get to the nature of the reading and writing task. Okay. Because it is so complex, it's not possible to teach it all at once. So we need to break it down into manageable bits. And that is the way that literacy has always been taught, is to decompose the language task and teach it in different activities. So for example, at the level of letter patterns in words, we have phonics programs. Or even before that, we have alphabet. Alphabet teaches the sounds of individual letters. At the level of the word, we have spelling activities and the sight word, or activity which is about memorising common words in the language. These activities, alphabet, sight words, phonics, are actually centuries old. They go back at least to the ancient Greeks. This is the way that literacy was taught to citizens, the children of citizens in Athens, for example. And basically the same activities have been reproduced generation after generation for thousands of years. We have vocabulary activities, which are memorising lists of vocabulary. We have basal readers. So when children are starting to read, they have little picture books with a word or a phrase or a sentence to a page, and they're supposed to build up their knowledge there. We have grammar activities, which focus at the level of sentences and word groups. We have composition activities, which are focused on well-formed paragraphs and sentences. In the 80s, we had the whole language process, which ignores all of this and just focuses on the context. In other words, the experience that the learner brings to the text. And in the 90s, we had critical literacy, which again ignores all of this and focuses on the context, but in this case, the social relations in the context. And since the 80s, we have this growing movement for genre writing, which starts with the context, looks at how texts are organised, and focuses on some language features. So no teachers, to my knowledge, just use one or the other of these. They use a combination of them. In Australia, this is called the balanced approach. And it doesn't work. It demonstrably doesn't work for a very large proportion of students, the students who are in that bottom range year after year after year in school. Why doesn't it work? Well, because what we've done here is we've disintegrated the language learning task. Instead of teaching it all at once, we've taught it in different activities, using different texts, different words, different letter patterns, different sounds, in different spaces in the teaching program. So children who come to school with an enormous amount of experience from reading with their parents, and in literate middle-class homes, children typically have 1,000 hours of reading with their parents before they start school. Those children have enough meaning base to be able to put all this together, recognise its function and develop as readers. Children who don't have that experience just can't put it together. It's just a bunch of stuff you do in school. So that's layered on to another problem, which is the reading development sequence, which is a hidden curriculum. It actually starts before school for successful children with this 1,000 hours of reading, and the function of what parents do with their children is to engage children in the meaningful, pleasurable business of reading. When they start school, they're ready for the activities I just showed you in the junior primary. The goal of those activities in the junior primary is to get kids independently reading by the end of year 2. They need to be independently reading by the end of year 2 because the focus when they get to the upper primary is on learning from reading. So explicit reading of teaching of reading skills starts to fall away as you move through the primary school, and the focus shifts to the content of the curriculum. It's essential that children are independently able to learn from reading by the end of primary school because that's the fundamental mode of learning in the high school. If you're not able to independently learn from reading, you can't do high school. And that's what happens to an overwhelming number of children in our societies, which is actually why we're here today. So what are we going to do about it? The first thing is we're going to use our understanding of how language works and how language learning works to develop an integrated curriculum, one which integrates the language task, starting with the context, so building up the background knowledge students need to access the text, and then instead of coming down to the level of sounds and letter patterns, we're going to look at whole texts to give students a guide to understand a text as we read it to them. So this is an activity we call preparing for reading. We give the students a summary of how the text is going to unfold in terms they can understand. That means they don't have to struggle at this level to follow the text as it's read, because it's being read to them. They don't have to struggle at this level to decode unfamiliar words. They can just listen closely to the words as the teacher reads them. So having read the text together, that forms a very strong platform for then teaching the students to read the text themselves. Now we move to an activity we call detail reading, which involves working through passages of text sentence by sentence and guiding all the students in the class to recognise and understand each group of words as we go through. We do that for about 20 minutes, and every student in the class will be able to read that passage with complete understanding because of the discussion we've had. That then forms a basis for coming down to this level, the level of the word, and working on spelling. We don't work on spelling words that the students are not already familiar with and understand, because meaning is 90% of reading. As I said before, if you're struggling at the level of meaning, then you're going to struggle at the level of decoding. So this is how we do it, and it's very successful, as I showed you. So we have 3 levels of support in this program. The first level focuses on whole texts. It starts with preparing for reading, as I just described to you. When we move to writing, we guide students to construct new texts in an activity we call joint construction. The next level of support we call detailed reading, where we take a short passage of text, as I said, work through it sentence by sentence, and then we practice rewriting that short passages of text, which shows students how to borrow the language of accomplished authors into their own writing. So that's the level on which we're working with grammar. And then the third level works on the foundation skills that students need, particularly in the primary school, to manually manipulate sentences by writing them on strips of paper or cardboard, cutting them up, moving them around. So we use these strategies for teaching beginning literacy and for reinforcing foundation skills in the primary school. So this is the whole program. There are 9 sets of strategies you can see, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this happening in practice. So our starting point is with whole text, as I said. I'm going to show you a junior secondary class who's working on science. In this case, it's a textbook chapter about cycles of the flow of matter. This is a diagram of the water cycle. What the teacher would do is introduce the topic, give the students a summary of what each paragraph is about, then read the paragraph, then move on to the next one, the next one, and the next one. So instead of avoiding using textbooks in the class because students can't read them, the teacher reads with the students and guides them and supports them so they all understand what's being read. So what the teacher then does, after having worked through several pages of text, she'll just take one short passage, such as this passage about the water cycle, and work through it sentence by sentence. So the principle of all of this is called guidance through interaction. Guidance through interaction starts with a teacher-regulated activity. Teacher-regulated means the teacher is leading and modelling. In other words, it's I do and you watch. The next step we're calling joint practice, where the teacher is working together with the students. In other words, I do, you help, you do, I help. And the third step is student-regulated, where the students are independently doing the task. In other words, you do and I watch. Now, if we look at traditional practice often goes too quickly from teacher-led and modelled to the independent tasks that students are required to do. Not all students are sufficiently prepared by the modelling for that to work effectively. With the progressivist or constructivist approach, the focus is on the student. So students are asked to do tasks often with very little of the teacher modelling. This is what is known as a student-centred approach. But both of those approaches are insufficient, give insufficient support for all students to learn. So our focus on reading to learn is with this middle area on the joint practice. So just returning to this, we do this With our outside circle, with preparing for reading, the teacher is guiding the students to be able to read a text with understanding and then guiding the students to be able to write a text successfully in joint construction. At the level of detailed reading, the teacher is again guiding students, but in a series of steps where the teacher prepares the students to be able to recognise words in the sentence and then hands control to the learner to identify the words themselves. And the same applies when we come to writing. The teacher is guiding the students to be able to write, to come up with wordings for new sentences and then handing control to the learners to write. And the same applies at this most supportive level. The teacher is guiding the students through those activities. Here's an example of the inner circle where students are manually manipulating sentences using the activity we call sentence making. We use little whiteboards or blackboards for the students to practice spelling and writing sentences after the teacher's guided them. So what do teachers need to be able to do all this successfully? Well, there are three dimensions to this. There's knowledge about language, there's knowledge about pedagogy, and there's guided practice in being able to use these strategies successfully. So there are four domains of knowledge about language that teachers need to be able to do this successfully. This first one is we need a clear understanding of the written genres of the school. You know, what we call knowledge genres, the genres in which knowledge is written and read in the school. They need a control over the spoken genres of learning in the classroom, what we call curriculum genres. And what we do in genre-based pedagogy is we design these classroom genres very carefully to ensure that all students are able to do the task successfully. And underpinning both of these levels, teachers need to be able to control patterns of language in sentences, which of course is known as grammar, as well as patterns of language in texts, which we call discourse. Now, this information has been built up over the years through research. It's available in books such as Working with Discourse, which focuses on patterns of language in texts, Genre Relations, which focuses on the knowledge genres which students read and write in the school, and Knowledge About Pedagogy is summed up in this book, Learning to Write, Reading to Learn, all of which are co-authored by myself and Jim Martin. And as far as guided practice is concerned, well, of course, we have the TEL4L program, which is the next step. Perhaps it's generation 4 in genre pedagogy, coming out of the Reading to Learn program, which you can learn more about from the website.
Sådan lød oplægget fra Dr. David Rose. Husk, du kan se det igen her på DK4 eller på videnomlæsning.dk. Jeg håber, du har fået masser af inspiration og gode idéer. Tak for, at du så med.